Okay, we talked about identification before. This is the connection that happens between you and some character within the story. And that works based upon three principles primarily. Number 1, number 3, and number 6. Number 1 said that the character must be good. I must see good motivations within the character. Number 3 said that character must be what? True to life, which means realistic. And what's number 6? Idealized. There's got to be some sort of attraction. I look at a person and say, that's the kind of person I want to be, and furthermore, that's the kind of person I sort of am. So there's this oneness between you and the character. Let's move to the plot. According to Aristotle, the tragic plot contains 4 major characteristics. Give me one. You're on. Must be intact, a beginning, middle, and end. That probably, once again, doesn't seem all that ground-shakingly unique to you. You've learned about beginning, middles, and ends in stories ever since you started studying stories. In fact, if you were writing a book report, chances are really good that way back when in grade school, a teacher said, oh, summarize the beginning, middle, and end of the story. Give me another characteristic. Lance. Can you explain that, cause and effect? That's right. So one event directly relates to the next, which relates to the next. So if a character makes a choice, then the next plot event seems to be the outcome of that choice. And the next plot event builds upon that outcome, and the next plot event builds upon that. So a single, unified, complete sequence of causality. Blake, you had your hand up too?
Yeah, of a certain magnitude.
Let's hold off on that. That's number 3. But let's talk about this unity of action for a moment.
Oh.
It's okay. You might think, once again, well, that seems pretty obvious. Isn't that how all stories work? Not necessarily. Which novel that you read freshman year contains multiple plot lines that don't necessarily build upon each other? Not Animal Farm. I would say that in the Animal Farm, you've got this event leads to this event leads to this event. Old Major's speech happens, and that combined with Farmer Jones' oppression leads to the revolution, leads to this, leads to this, leads to this. It's one unified story. What is not? What did you read freshman year that seemed to have multiple plot lines with multiple characters, different stories that didn't seem to interact on one another?
I don't know what it was called. I'm sorry, this is very helpful, but it was the suicide.
Ordinary People, I'd say, is pretty unified around Cal's experience too. Tim. 1984 is pretty unified against around Winston's experience. Yeah. Why? Tom Robinson case, one plot line. What else? Give me another plot line within To Kill a Mockingbird that is separate and distinct and doesn't depend on either of those. You're sitting there staring at me. There are others, Mr. Clarkson? Oh, Dill? Yeah, Dill. The whole story of Dill seems unrelated to Boo Radley and unrelated to Tom Robinson. They're coincident, which means they happen in the same time and place, but they're not causally related. Nothing that Dill does causally affects the Tom Robinson trial. So those two are separate. What else? You're on? Who's the old lady on morphine? Not now. Maudie Atkinson's a different person. Oh, man. Mrs. Dubose. Yeah. What's the rabid dog's name? Tim Johnson. Not Tom Robinson. Tim Johnson. Okay, so in To Kill a Mockingbird, Harper Lee develops several storylines that are causally independent. The story of Mrs. Dubose does not have anything to do with the story of Boo Radley, except thematically. So you could say, well, Mr. Clarkson, they're all about superficiality and not judging a book by its cover. I know, that's a theme relationship. Aristotle's saying, in theory, it must be one intact plot line focusing on one person and that person's experience. No distractions, no anything. It's got to be a unified singular engine. To Kill a Mockingbird would not qualify. I'd say that 1984 would qualify because it's the story of Winston. He makes a decision, takes an action, there's a consequence, and so on and so forth. Pretty unified. What was the third, Blake?
Of a certain magnitude.
What does that mean, of a certain magnitude? That's Aristotle's language. What does he mean by that?
The length and simplicity, both quantitatively.
You're tripping over words that you've got there. Like it means must be important. Magnitude is the size, the measure, the scope. Saying this must be an important issue. The conflict with which we deal must be important. What's the core conflict, encounter, story that Oedipus the King tells? Yeah. Well, it tells of a disease, but that's really the outcome of something else. Paulina. Define the gods. Oedipus says, I will stand up to Apollo and I will resist the prophecy and it will not happen to me. Arrogance in the face of the gods. Does, how's that important? How's that relevant to you? You're not defying Apollo, and hopefully, Lance, you're not slated or prophesied to kill your father or do anything else untoward. So how can this possibly relate to, how can it be important to you? Paulina. Oh, obeying the man? Go ahead. Go ahead.
Like your parents or something, someone like a greater. Like,
I think I would go further than just other people and go to other forces beyond your control. A good example, this morning it was snowing. Did anybody even notice that? Yeah, snow. Big old flakes. You can see, of course, now it's turned to water because it's probably about 45 degrees out there in the middle of February. As I was standing here and teaching, looking out the window, it's very pretty, and of course I was feeling very human and very superior, thinking, ha ha ha, I'm standing in this cool building that is not cool but actually warm. And as I look outside and think about being out in that snow, I realize that I won. I and the rest of humanity have won. We have defeated the elements. We have built this building, nice air ducts conveying heat. I have victory over the weather. It's good, right? Where is that a problem? Yeah, I think it's a problem when you're a resident of New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina and you decide to approach the weather with that sort of human arrogance. So, are we talking about religious matters here? Possibly. We could also just be talking about human arrogance and the lack of humility we have because we think that we have defeated evolution, we've defeated the weather, we've defeated every natural force there is. We rule. Until global warming, earthquakes, hurricanes, or Justin Bieber come down and make us realize that they're just forces beyond our control. It deals with important issues. What's number 4? Either simple or complex, but complex is better. Complex. I've listed some of the important Greek concepts there. However, don't worry so much about it. I will focus on those in more depth. And this is actually the bridge point into the further analysis of how the plot functions, how it works. We've had 4 different descriptions of the virtues of a tragic plot that Aristotle discusses. Let's take a look at this complex issue in more detail. We've got our tragic hero, still unclothed, and he is about to engage in this unified plot. Dun, 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 dun. Oh, right. So he's going to walk on this unified causality, inevitable. It's like a train out of control. And that's Oedipus, about to embark upon that problem. What starts him on it? his defying of the gods. This moment in tragedy is referred to by what Greek term? It was not just on the screen. No, that one's different. What Greek term refers to that sort of mistake, that problem that incites all of the rest of this? Lance? Hamartia? You could say hamartia. Sometimes I say hamartia. Sometimes I say hamartia. Sometimes I say hamartia and think about the Brady Bunch. And that makes me sad, so go back to hamartia. How's it translate? Paulina. Many modern theorists translate this as a tragic flaw. If that's the case, what is Oedipus' tragic flaw? Arrogance, pride, absolutely. Hubris. Very nice word, Christian. Thank you. And Oedipus the King, the play, explores that pride and arrogance several times over. If you read the play, when you watch the play, think about how Sophocles actually develops his arrogance. Now, the literal translation of hamartia actually says something more about just an error in judgment, a mistake, not necessarily a flaw in character. But I've always felt more comfortable with the theory that subscribes to a flaw in character, because I think it's more explanatory of later tragedies. Let's use it in Romeo and Juliet. What's their tragic flaw? If all tragedies must contain tragic heroes that contain a tragic flaw, and in Romeo and Juliet we say really we have two tragic heroes, Romeo and Juliet, and they're pretty much interchangeable, then what's their tragic flaw? Alex? Okay, secret keeping. So do you think they are deceptive people? True. However, I'm not sure that deception is part of their character. They need to keep a secret out of necessity. But I'm not sure that deception is part of their character. In what sense are they immature? I don't know, like a minute? Right. Shakespeare and Nicholas Sparks. They're both love at first sight. And then dead. Yeah, true, actually, both of them. I would agree with Catherine that Romeo and Juliet seem to be the perfect teenagers. Very passionate, very idealistic, very good, and extraordinarily impetuous. Wow, look at that woman over there across the room. I am in love with her. Body and soul. I love you too. I love you. Let's get married tomorrow. We can't wait. If they had stopped for a moment, consulted with the friar, talked to each other, tried to figure out some way in which they could actually have this marriage and ease the tensions among their family, maybe things would have been different. But the fact was that they couldn't stop for a moment to catch their breath. And because of that, everything spirals out of control. And you could say that their impetuousness is the flaw that causes the tragedy within Romeo and Juliet, which means that they brought it upon themselves. And that's what Peripeteia means. What's the translation? What does it mean? Yeah, Brian. A reversal of intentions. I intend to do this. It actually does this. Another really convenient modern way to conceive of this is tragic irony. The tragic hero brings the tragedy upon him or herself. You could say that Romeo and Juliet did not cause their own deaths, that really their family's feud caused the death. The family feud is the context, however, it's their actions within that feud that led to their deaths. They didn't need to die. And they could have had each other. They could have been rational about the whole thing. But Shakespeare's trying to explore our impetuousness. We act as they do. There's a truth to what they do. a truth that deserves examining. And that's why it happens, and that's what tragedy is doing. With Oedipus, he tries to protect his parents, he tries to protect his city, he tries to act like a good person, and in doing so, he gives in to his arrogance and causes his own downfall. And that downfall could be considered the catastrophe. The disaster at the end. The tragic hero commits an error, probably through their tragic flaw, and causes their own catastrophe, an exchange known as Peripeteia. That catastrophe leads to ananorisis. The G is silent. What does that mean? You're on. Yeah, insight. And remember, we've seen that. There's old Ed without his eyes. Oedipus has gained insight. That insight has cost him his family, his kingdom, and his eyes. It's the moment at which he understands that he is responsible for his own demise. He has brought this upon himself. Is such a moment present in Romeo and Juliet? Maybe not to the extent that it is in Oedipus. And you'll always find variations. You could say that, well, the ananorisis is not as present in Romeo and Juliet. Maybe that makes it less of a tragedy than Oedipus the King. Aristotle might agree with you. But this is how it works. Tragic hero makes a mistake. Every mistake then leads to a consequence, which leads to a consequence, which leads to a consequence. Logically, train out of control on a track, and then eventually ends in catastrophe and could have gone nowhere else. Inevitable. Once that first mistake is made, there's no avoiding anything. But really, in Oedipus the King, Aristotle says this is such a great tragedy because much of this has already happened before the play even opens. The play is really about this moment, about exploring Oedipus finding out, exploring Oedipus realizing his own fate and his own destruction. And I think Aristotle believes that's what makes it truly great, is that it prioritizes that human moment of insight, philosophical, spiritual, and so on. None of this happens within a vacuum. None of this happens on its own, and the audience is always present. Tragedy, especially one enacted on a stage, makes no sense without an audience. So Aristotle says that this entire thing must always be understood in context of an audience. Never forget, if you ever sit, by the way, some of you will, some of you want to, sit to write poetry, sit to write a story, sit to write something, you always remember that it's useless, of limited use, unless it addresses its audience. You could sit there in your room at 2 a.m. manically scribbling poetry on napkins and do what you'd like and read it for yourself, but like I said, that's of limited use. If you're actually constructing some writing, considering an audience, and how you could share that with them, it's much more evolved. This is supposed to evoke what in the audience? What emotional reactions? Huh? That is true. But what twin emotions does Aristotle state? Paulina? Pity and fear. Pity and fear. Pity for the tragic hero, right? Why do I pity him? Alice. Because I identified with him. You ever had that connection with a fictional character? Yeah? Paige, you got an example for me? Fictional character that you felt so strongly for that when good things happened, you felt rejoice. When awful things happened, you felt devastated.
I can't really think of any specifics, but just like a lot of books that I'll read and like that.
You can identify with characters. Tyler, you got an example?
Okay, well, this weekend,
Yeah.
my dad and I, we watched The Shining,
Yes.
and he made me, well, this is
Did you watch the miniseries or the old Stanley Kubrick film
the film.
with Jack Nicholson?
And
Okay.
I guess I connected with the wife because I felt bad for her, and I wanted to, like, cut the like, Jack guy's head off because he was so mean.
So the film works by helping you identify not with him, but with her, right? Because she's the victim, right? And it's probably scarier if you identify with her. And so the film, and we could talk about filmic techniques, asks you to identify with her. And so when she's afraid, you're afraid. And when Psycho's banging in the door with an axe, you feel like you're sitting there in the bathroom about to be, yeah, red rum, exactly. Good. That's an excellent example. Anybody have other examples of identification? Yeah, Allie.
Well, like, in Marley and Me,
Yes.
because you feel bad for the owner because of the dog, and how the dog died. It's really relatable.
Marley and Me figures, especially for this audience, Sylvania audience, it figures a relatively well-off, suburban, normal kind of family, husband, wife, 3 kids eventually, I think.
Yeah.
2 or 3 kids. Right, and so that might be very relatable. And so when the dog dies and you think, I have a dog, they have a dog, they look like a family like me, they have the same sort of inclinations and activities, and therefore I feel awful too. My experience, probably most prominent, happened in about 4th or 5th grade. Have any of you seen or read A Bridge to Peripeteia? Okay, well, most of the class. Excellent. Made you cry? Why? Absolutely. At that point, in my life, the protagonist, who was a boy of roughly my age when I read it, I didn't even notice what was going on, but he was so incredibly similar to me in many respects that I identified so strongly with him that when this girl, that was alternately his best friend as well as somebody he was falling in love with, dies, I felt like I was ripped apart. I didn't see it coming, and I was young and fragile, and I had identified so strongly with the character that I felt like I had lost my best friend. The emotional reaction of pity and fear, these twin emotions, Aristotle says, should work in such a way that you are overcome. And if you've ever felt overcome with emotion watching a film or reading a book, then you know what he's talking about. The pity only works if we can identify, if we can feel that this person is realistic and somebody like us. Why would I feel afraid? You're on? If it happens to Oedipus, it can happen to me. That guy's like big king, powerful. If these forces can bring down the most powerful person that I can see, remember the idealized character? If this can bring down the idealized character, then it could happen to me. And in fact, tragedies work best if somebody goes from a great height to a low depth. There's no tragedy if you watch a dirt farmer become a dirt farmer. It's like, well, you're sad and broke, and now you're sad and broke again. A little sadder, maybe a little bit more broke, but that's that. But Romeo and Juliet, what have they lost? They are incredible expressions of life. They are young, they are passionate, they are moral. They're about as alive as characters can be. And then they're dead. Oedipus is a king, beloved by his people, powerful, and then he's a blind beggar that nobody will talk to, touch, go near, own. It's an incredible fall from a great height. If these emotions are strong enough, you can achieve what Aristotle has described as catharsis. Catharsis is a psychological concept that Aristotle talks about 2,500 years ago, and many psychiatrists and psychologists believe today does work in certain circumstances. The idea being that you feel negative emotions to such an extent that you're able to purge them. It's therapy. I like to think of the metaphor of a fuse in electrical engineering. What is a fuse? What does it do? What's its purpose? Or a circuit breaker. You could think of the same thing. What does a circuit breaker do? No? You're typical honor students. You know all these academic concepts. You have no clue how things work. Neither do I, by the way. But anyway.
It's supposed to, like, it's a safety thing.
That's right. So as far as I understand it, if there's an overwhelming amount of electricity flowing through the circuit breaker, the fuse blows, trips, and stops the flow. Why? So it doesn't blow the whole system. It's a safety. So your circuit breaker box is basically a safety mechanism to make sure that some kind of spike in electricity doesn't blow your entire circuit system. What happens with catharsis? An overwhelming amount of negative emotion just sort of blows the circuit. And you don't really feel it anymore. You purge it. It's gone. It's almost like working it out to get rid of it in a fictional, artificial context, which can be really helpful. And Aristotle says if tragedy is working properly, then people flock to tragedy, they think about it, they feel, and they're able not only to work out some of these issues, but also to feel better about themselves.
So, like, on a psychological level, if I'm feeling bad about, if I'm feeling pain or pity or something, it's more beneficial for me to watch more of that.
Correct. Rather than ignore it, to actually exercise that negative emotion, and according to Aristotle, to feel such an overwhelming amount of it that you're just able to sort of let go of it. Because at a certain point, I guess your psyche has to just get rid of it, or else it'll be crushed, right? So you have this overwhelming amount of negative emotion, it just sort of goes away. Now, some modern-day psychologists and psychiatrists would probably take issue with that and say, yeah, it doesn't work that way. But there's also adherence to the concept of catharsis, of that break from negative emotion. And it's what Aristotle described, like I said, 2,500 years ago. And that's it. It's a perfect little machine that he says is built for one purpose, to help the audience feel better about themselves. And it's art, so he believes it's beautiful, because he thinks that all art aims to be beautiful and aims to represent reality. And that's that. Questions? No? Okay. Then how will you apply this? Two ways. Number one, on Sunday you will, and I can't remember, it's scheduled on the website, you'll take the in-class essay for the Choose Your Own Greek Tragedy unit, which will ask you to apply these concepts to your play. So tell me how, what is the tragic flaw or the error in judgment committed by your tragic hero? Or is there a moment of anagnorisis, or is there not a moment of anagnorisis where the tragic hero recognizes the responsibility that he or she has? Who is the tragic hero according to Aristotle's rules? And anything else that we've talked about connected to this tragedy theory. The other way is through the modern tragedy assignment that I'll talk about in detail on Friday, but that's where you start to see these concepts in something from the 20th century or later, a book, play, or film, or a TV series, cartoon possibly. So if you can see a modern day example of this, then that's what you'll write your paper about. And we'll talk about it more in detail. So 2 papers coming up in which you must use this theory and apply them to other circumstances. But that is that.